Record rainfall has caused record flooding throughout portions of Brazil in conditions that have been described by the government as catastrophic. Elsewhere in the Latin America Caribbean region, the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control has imposed more sanctions on Nicaragua, including visa restrictions on Nicaraguan officials. For this and more, we go to Nicaragua to speak with Camila Escalante in Managua and Stephen Sefton in Esteli. First, Camila, could you tell us about this flooding?
Well, in Brazil, we've seen some historic, massive flooding after some torrential downpour of rains, and that has affected the south of the country, and we've seen huge numbers of people disappeared and dead. People have lost all of their livelihoods, their homes, and thankfully, because of Brazil's national government stepping in, they're going to be able to recover some of those things. President Lula announced just yesterday in a speech a number of things and subsidies that are going to be helping these people who have lost their refrigeration, people who have lost their mattresses and their homes will be getting those things either replaced in the terms of their homes. The government announced that they will be replacing the homes for everyone who lost their home. And the national government also announced $1,000 US dollars for those who lost things such as mattresses in their homes. And this is expected by the government to benefit at least 200,000 families. And we'll get back to that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the situation in Argentina, because it's very interesting. Argentina has a little bit of the opposite case where they have this U.S. puppet neoliberal government, and the labor movement, unions, and the social movements in Argentina are fighting right now against deregulation and, misery that is to come. They're fighting against hyperinflation. And we've seen since December when Javier Milei, this president and this government took office, that there have been large uprisings and protests. They're saying now that annual inflation in Argentina is going to be almost 300%. And that month by month, of course, consumer prices are increasing massively for basic products that people need to survive, to be able to eat. And things like the price of milk is shooting up, and they say now that milk in Argentina costs more than in Norway, if you can believe that, with, of course, a much lower minimum wage in Argentina. Things like electricity, heating, gas, fuel, and public transportation is going to be increasing. And of course, this is all while poverty is significantly increasing, and just worker conditions are becoming much worse. And this is all at the same time, this economic crisis that is being exacerbated every day is all happening while their president is legalizing the possession of arms in Argentina. He actually has said, Milei has said, that countries that have liberalized the possession of guns have less crime. That is the way he sees things. And he, of course, had always promised to liberalize the Argentine economy. And at the same time, he says that, we know that he, of course, rejected entry into the BRICS. That has and will have a lot of different consequences. And, in addition to that, I think this is where it begins to connect back to Brazil, is he's receiving all that help from the United States military, receiving the U.S. aircrafts, and he's cutting back on environmental protections. And so despite that the right wing back in Brazil controls this flooded area of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, they will be receiving $1.1 billion help from the BRICS, which wouldn't be available and won't be available in the case of Argentina if any of this is to happen. And guess what? There is actually rising flood levels in the rivers in Argentina as well, because Argentina, Uruguay, and southern Brazil are right there next to each other. So it's really interesting how, despite this massive devastation, which shouldn't be, it shouldn't be minimized in any way, that is happening to Brazil. It's actually amazing that it hasn't made greater headlines, I would say. The images are really impressive, to say the least, of the mass flooding. That they still, because of the help of the central government and now the help of BRICS and the supports of the national government, that they'll be able to come out of this despite the tragedy of all those who died. In the meantime, in Argentina, things are getting progressively worse for workers in a very immediate way, just in a matter of 5 months of this government.
Thank you, Don. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Camila for that important background about Brazil and Argentina. It seems to me that in many ways we're talking about a common thread running through all our conversations about Latin America and the Caribbean, namely the counterproductive reality resulting from electoral cycles that allow for a social democrat government to be in power for a certain amount of time, and then almost always there's a reaction, an electoral reaction, that lets in a right-wing government, usually with extremely unhelpful neoliberal policies. And we can see this in what Camila was talking about Brazil and Argentina. For example, in Brazil, the governor of the Rio Grande do Sul province is a young politician, 33, 34 years old, Eduardo Leite, and he's a right-wing politician who's unfortunately facing unprecedented rains, something like the rains of a whole rainy season have fallen in just 4 days in the area for which he's responsible. But there's a sense in which he himself and his predecessors, mostly right-wing governors in that province, have created the situation whereby their neoliberal policies have neglected environmental protection in the region, and that has led to the catastrophic effects on thousands of families. I saw a report in France 24 that said there are 1.5 million people displaced across that area, the southern part of Brazil, which is a disaster. But that has to do with the neoliberal policies that have been imposed by politicians like Eduardo Leite and his the predecessor to Lula da Silva, Jair Bolsonaro. And you can see that again in Argentina, whereby Mauricio Macri from 2016 to 2020 laid the ground for the policies of this latest right-wing government under Javier Milei, which are proving absolutely disastrous for the great majority of people in Argentina. So that in that regional context, in that continental context, revolutionary governments like the Sandinista government here in Nicaragua, the Bolivarian government in Venezuela, and the Cuban Communist government in Cuba represent a strong counter-trend to all that environmental, social, and economic the disaster, really, of all of the neoliberal policies in those areas, in environmental terms, in economic terms, and in social terms too. So where you have Venezuela and Nicaragua and let's leave Cuba out of it now, because the blockade there just complicates things. But in the case of Nicaragua and Venezuela, you're talking about very strong measures for poverty reduction, massive democratization of the society, so that the economic policies implemented by the government bring more and more people, especially women, into productive economic activity. Through all kinds of ways, and also the emphasis on, especially in Nicaragua, and also too in more recent years in Venezuela, on food self-sufficiency. That has been a tremendous component in the democratization, the economic democratization in particular, here in Nicaragua. So, but all those policies go very, very strongly against the trend of the IMF dictated policies that you see currently in Argentina. And they're very much In Nicaragua, it's an extraordinary contradiction between Nicaragua and countries like, for example, Colombia, where Gustavo Petro has tried really hard to implement land reform and more economic democratization, but he can't do it because the right wing are so entrenched there. And that's the same in Brazil, it's the same in Argentina, same in Ecuador, same in Peru. It's only in revolutionary countries like Nicaragua and Venezuela that you get this economic democratization and the democratization in general of the country's society. And that is why Nicaragua and Venezuela are subject to these so-called sanctions, which we prefer to call by the United Nations term unilateral coercive measures, because only the United Nations Security Council is legally entitled to impose sanctions. So now the United States is trying to push through legislation in the Senate that will actually make effective an executive order that came into being in October 2022, a presidential executive order called Taking Additional Steps to Address the National Emergency in Nicaragua. And that itself was based on the so-called Renacer Act of 2021. Now, what that executive order talks about is in effect, a boycott of trade with Nicaragua. It would block the importation into the United States of any products of Nicaraguan origin that the government decides are not to be imported into the United States, and it also means the imposition of quite severe punitive measures against individuals of all kinds. And recently, the Treasury in the United States has announced measures that affect over 200 individuals and other entities in Nicaragua. And this is all part of the United States ratcheting up its efforts to impose a trade boycott against Nicaragua so as to affect the majority of the population, so that in future elections they'll tend to support the opposition and not the governing Sandinista party. And that essentially that's what the US policy is about. But the reason for it is that Nicaragua, like Venezuela, has been extraordinarily successful in its social and economic policies that make countries like Argentina, for example, Peru, Ecuador, for example, look like complete basket cases. And that is the reason the United States is attacking Nicaragua.
Stephen and Camilla, thank you very much. We'll speak with you again next week.
Thank you, Don.
Thanks a million, Don. Look forward to it.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.